We're joined now by our international correspondent, Alex Newman, to talk about some of the latest education news. Alex, we've got an organization called Christian World Vision. It's supposedly founded by evangelicals. They're operating out of Brazil, which, as we know, is a Christian country. And they have taken the really odd and alarming stance that homeschooling should be prohibited, that they see homeschooling, this so-called evangelical Christian group, they see that as some kind of a threat to children and to the state itself. Talk about who Christian World Vision is.
Yeah, thank you, Duke. It's a very alarming story because World Vision is a pretty well-known charity. They operate around the world. In fact, they have major operations in the United States. And without knowing for sure, I would venture to say probably most of their donors are in the United States. It's very popular. Like at Christmas time, you can like buy a goat for family in Uganda or Latin America or something like that. So they get a lot of money from American evangelicals, and they portray themselves as an evangelical Christian aid organization to help feed children and widows and things like that. But more and more, they have become a left-wing activist group, and this case in Brazil, I think, really illustrates the point. They joined with a coalition of, really radical, fringe, left-wing wackadoodle groups, pro-abortion groups, black supremacist, racist groups, pro-homosexual groups, socialist groups, globalist groups. To attack homeschooling. They signed a letter, a manifesto, saying that homeschooling was dangerous for children, that it was unconstitutional, and that Brazilian authorities should continue to regulate it. And frankly, I think if their donors in the United States knew about that, they would be absolutely appalled.
Is there a central group of donors in the Americas that we could reach out to with this story? I mean, or are they getting money in drips and drabs from all sorts of organizations? It'd be interesting to know who their primary funders are in this country, and really pose the question to them: do you know this is happening, and how do you feel about it?
Yeah, and this has been happening to so many evangelical groups, too. Okay? In fact, at the Newman report at FreedomProject Media, I think it was last year, we talked about how what used to be called, the Campus Crusade for Christ, now they call it a CREW, I think, had also been kind of infiltrated by these radical left-wing forces. And so all over America, you have, naive, very decent, good Christian folks who are donating money to these organizations, thinking that it's going to support widows and orphans, thinking that it's going to spread the gospel around the world, and instead you have these very dishonest left-wing activists, most of whom I would say are probably not even Christian, who've wiggled their way into the leadership of these organizations, and they're diverting all this Christian money that was intended for good purposes into promoting left-wing extremism, anti-family antics, and now, as we see in Brazil, attacks on homeschooling. And World Vision, I've seen, I've been to a lot of these United Nations conferences over the last decade, and they're one of the staples. They've got all this propaganda material out there demanding global action on climate change and global wealth redistribution. So, I think it's going to be really important for Americans and especially American Christian donors to these organizations to get a fuller understanding of what's going on. And going forward, I think Christians in America now need to quit being naive, and they need to do a much better job vetting organizations before they send money, because they go and it's got a nice Christian webpage, and then behind the scenes, all this money is actually being used to advance the cause of anti-Christian forces. It's very sad.
Yeah, and you'd think the title, Christian World Vision, would be a bit of a tip-off, right? I mean, when Christians start taking a world vision, when it's almost impossible not to see that as a move towards globalism. And you've said that many of these seemingly Christian organizations are really about globalism. Can you be a little bit more specific in the minute we have left, though? Are there ways outside of education and their attack on homeschool that Christian World Vision is participating in left-wing causes? Do you have other examples of that?
Yeah, so going to these United Nations conferences, really, they have been putting out all kinds of propaganda. It's very unusual to see, American evangelical groups participating in these bizarre UN conferences. And having gone to these conferences, it's very, very clear that they are anti-Christian to the core. I went to one in Madrid in December, and probably the main topic that was talked about more than anything else was limiting the population of human beings. Now, an evangelical Christian organization would say, well, God said be fruitful and multiply. God said children are a blessing. What are we going to have to do with this, right? Be not yoked with unbelievers. And yet World Vision has been, 100% behind this UN Sustainable Development Agenda, this climate agenda. And that's where I really started getting suspicious about them. Then this homeschooling thing dropped, and that was just a strike three, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the infiltration of Christianity rather than the conquering of it is what they're planning for. And when we come back after this short break, Alex, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about their attack on education and talk more about the topic generally. Back with our international correspondent, Alex Newman, talking about Christian World Vision, a putatively evangelical organization that is siding with all sorts of anti-Christian, left-wing globalist causes. Alex, this is the kind of stuff I expect to hear about the Catholic Church. When I think about the degree to which the Catholic Church is completely sold out all across, and I'm not talking about all Catholics or all priests, I'm talking about the structural church of the Roman Catholic faith, how it has literally sold out to globalists. It's working with the communist Chinese to subvert Christianity, Roman Catholicism. They're allowing communist bishops of the communist state to appoint leadership of the Christian Catholic Church in China. I expect that from the Catholic Church because of their horrible record, their terrible mismanagement, their shoddy leadership, their corrupt pope. I get it, right? As somebody who had 20 years of Catholic schools, I find it reprehensible. But now when you see it infiltrating evangelical culture, right? I mean, and there's a certain insidious cleverness about this. We can't topple Christianity. We can't drive people of faith away from it. But what we can do is co-opt it. What we can do is play the game, right? Pretend that if Jesus were alive today, he'd be manning the barricades with a gun. If Jesus were alive today, he'd be looting Target alongside the protesters in America. This kind of jackbooted to the barricades kind of militant Christianity, right? Where you've seen, you saw the old pictures of Che Guevara on a crucifix, right? That garbage has been around for a long time. Why do you think it's having the success it's having in evangelical communities now?
Well, I think part of it is pastors have really been asleep at the wheel. But, I mean, also, if we look at this honestly, we need to recognize that there is a concerted effort to infiltrate and subvert the churches in the United States, Catholic, Orthodox, Evangelical, Protestant, all of them. And there's actually going to be a great documentary coming out on this subject very soon, produced by people that you and I both know, Judd Saul and Trevor Loudon, called Enemies Within the Church. And I think this is probably going to be one of the most important documentaries of the year. If not the decade, because what they're going to show, and this happened also very much in the Catholic Church. You had enemies of the churches, in some cases, actual Soviet agents, members of communist parties, infiltrating the seminaries, infiltrating the ministries and the churches, and trying to hijack them. And if they couldn't be hijacked, then they would neutralize them. And this has been, I think, one of the leading causes of America's steady decline into losing our liberties, into the rioting and the looting that we see on the streets now. It's been the neutralization or even the infiltration and the hijacking of the Christian churches. It's an incredibly serious issue. We've got to take it seriously. And this craziness from World Vision, I think, is such a good example of that. Fortunately, our friend Julio Severo, he's a prominent Brazilian evangelical, brought this to the attention of the world. And I hope people will go read his essay because he's had dealings with them before in Brazil. It seems like the operation in Brazil has been under the control of the hard left for a long time now, actual socialists. And we're starting to see that now, all over the world, not just with World Vision, but all kinds of supposedly Christian ministries that are still running on funding from devout Christians. It's dishonest, it's false advertising, and I think donors are owed a big explanation.
Yeah, and if you want a further example of how this long game, socialist long game, corrupting the churches, think about the 1960s where we got liberation theology, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, where you had all of these Latin American countries go full socialist, and the socialist dialectic then became transformed. We can call it socialism, we can call it Marxism. We called it liberation theology, which was basically socialism applied to Christian faith, to the unmaking of Christian faith. The generation of priests that went to seminary in the liberation theology age in the 60s turned out to be a huge number of those priests that molested all those little kids in their secular anti-Christian values, right? And so you've got a pope now from South America, from a liberation theology perspective, who's an absolute disaster for Christianity. He is a globalist first, and I'm beginning to think a Marxist a close second. And we're down on the list. I find him as a Christian. It's very hard to identify. We've only got about 30 seconds left. Give us a final comment on what Christian Vision is doing and what might be done to combat that in places like Brazil.
Yeah, so this is the time for Christians to be discerning. It's no longer enough to just say, oh, well, they've got Christian in the name, or they've got Christian written on their website, they've got a nice picture of a cross, I'll send them a check. Christians, be very careful about who you give your money to. There's still a lot of great ministries out there. There's a lot of great missionaries. There's a lot of great people, feeding orphans and widows. But there are also a lot of wolves in sheep's clothing. And the last thing we want is for the money from God's people to be going to the enemies of God and the church. It's crucial that people get involved now.